Oregon swinging for what could be their best offensive line recruiting haul ever.
You are Locked On Ducks, your daily podcast on the Oregon Ducks. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Yes, it is that time. Once again for Locked On Ducks, I'm your host, Spencer McLaughlin. Thank you so much for making this your first listen or your first view of the day, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day and your number one source to stay up to date with the Ducks. This episode brought to you by our friends over at Nissan and the all-new 2025 Nissan Armada. Stay with us for the Armada Team of the Week later in the episode. Brian Smith from Locked On the Portal is here to discuss a myriad of recruiting thoughts and nuggets today, but I want to hop into the trenches, Brian, and we'll get to skill position guys a little bit later. But Oregon's already got Kodi Greene committed, who's one of the top offensive tackles in the class, 5-star, 24/7 composite kid. That's not stopping him and offensive line coach Alik Terry from going after Jackson Cantwell, one of the top offensive tackles, and Immanuel Iheanacho, who's another 5-star offensive tackle. Let's start with Iheanacho. What's the latest there, and how in the thick of it is Oregon?
They are right in the middle of it. Everybody is offered him. There wasn't anybody that didn't. I remember seeing him as a sophomore and thinking he looks like he's 25 years old. He wasn't old enough to drive a car, but he's 352 pounds and can play left tackle. Those are good traits. And from Oregon, Maryland, Penn State, Michigan, Georgia, everybody has offered him. He's got a visit coming up to the Ducks pretty soon, which I'm sure makes your listeners very happy. But we need to see how that goes, because Maryland is now trending as the new school that's spending a ton of NIL money, and it's a 1-2 battle with the local school because he's from just outside the area where Maryland is at. He's maybe an hour and 20 minutes from the campus, then all the way across country, the Ducks. It's bizarre, but that's the recruiting world we live in 2026 or 25 for the 26 class.
Yeah, that's about the equivalent of growing up just south of Portland or an hour south of Eugene and being a 5-star offensive tackle prospect. Like, yeah, you're going to give Oregon a look in that regard. But the difference, Brian, is this is someone who is coveted by everybody in the country, lots of heavy hitters. You mentioned a number of them. Michigan, of course, known for their great offensive lines. I believe Alabama's been in the fold for Iheanacho as well. But Maryland is that outlier. And to me, that gives me a flashback to Teteroa McMillan, who was an incredibly highly rated kid, was down to Oregon, Arizona, goes to Arizona, and everyone's kind of going, he went where now? And that's just, where he wanted to go. But for Iheanacho, even though Maryland is, trying to up their spending efforts, do you see them as being a serious player here? Because usually Oregon's the outlier school. At some level they still are, but from a branding standpoint, Maryland is the outlier here.
Well, because they're in on so many kids locally and they're spending a lot of NIL money, 7-figure NIL money. Yes, they are 100% in this. Ely, arguably the top defensive end in the country. They got his commitment. They've secured him. He's shut down his recruitment. His NIL package is ridiculous. There are a lot of cases like this. So I don't know what Immanuel is getting, but Immanuel Iheanacho probably is going to command just as much. Offensive tackle, as you know, Spencer, is a premium position. So the Ducks are going to be battling a school that has similar. One of their main boosters is the guy that owns Under Armour. So it's kind of ironic considering the main booster runs Nike for Oregon. But a big battle of shoe companies here. But this is a kid also that may just want to stay home at the end of the day. You never know. But he's taken visits a lot of different places. I don't know how you kind of try to beat up on Maryland because they're never that good. It'll be interesting to see how it's combated. Maybe that's the pitch. Why go there? They're not going to the playoff. But other than that, they are the close school, and he's very familiar with their staff.
Also kind of reminds me, Georgia Tech landed a kid in this past cycle, a 5-star offensive lineman who it was, what was his name?
I can't, he had 4
Petty?
Petty, Josh Petty.
Josh Petty, I think what was the kid's name. And I feel like more and more of those sorts of recruitments are popping up in the NIL era, Brian, because I think you have smaller brands that are realizing, we have an opportunity to kind of move our way up the recruiting rankings and the caliber of player that we can roll through because, we weren't paying kids under the table before, but now we can just pay them above board. And I think that allows schools like a Maryland to kind of get themselves into the folder. You look at SMU and they get to the ACC championship game their first year in the conference. Why? Coming up from the American, because they spend an outrageous amount of money and they're willing to do it. And if you have those sorts of resources, it can be a differentiating factor for a kid. But the other offensive tackle that Oregon is after is Jackson Cantwell, and let's just start with him. What's the latest there?
Pick a school that he has visited, and somebody in my industry thinks that that's where he's going. He's one of the harder kids to figure out, and maybe it's because he just doesn't know where he's going. But I've been around him. Great guy. Dad's a great guy. But they visited Nebraska and Missouri the most because it's local. He's from Missouri. But he's been to Oregon multiple times. He's interested in Michigan, Alabama, Georgia. He was just at Miami. This is a situation where I don't know where he's going to go. My money's just on the state school because it's the easiest pick and his parents went there. But like one of my friends thinks that he's going to Oregon. I know the Miami staff thinks they've got a great shot to get him. This is just insane because every single person has a different answer. So don't predict it because your chances are low. There's a lot of teams still in it, but Cantwell has not really narrowed it down to like 5 to 6 schools yet. So Oregon's in the mix, and they're certainly a viable option, and they need tackles in this class. So that's possible, but he doesn't know where he's going yet. That's for sure.
Do you think there's another major threat for Cantwell between Missouri or outside of Missouri, Miami, and Oregon? Do you think it's those three? Like, he hasn't officially set out a list of like, hey, here's my final one. But would those be your kind of betting odds to be the leaders in the clubhouse right now?
The other one is Nebraska because he's been there so many times. And it's fairly close. So that's a possibility. But I don't know if I would even narrow it under 5 because he's legitimately not a kid that's going to rush into anything. Just his personality. He's kind of an all shucks, laid back guy until he puts on a helmet, and then good luck to you. But I don't think he's in any rush. This may carry out into the fall because I don't know if he can narrow it down and still go to class, so take care of his high school team and all that, and take care of all these visits. So you got me. This may be the most fascinating recruitment of the entire cycle. It might be for the best player because, I mean, he's from South Missouri. There's like hardly anybody comes out of the area where he's from, and his dad's an Olympian. His mom's an Olympian, and he is a freak. So good luck. If you can lay money on it, you'd win if you hit because there's still a lot of options out there.
Yeah, pretty solid genes there. Both parents.
Yeah, like I met his dad. When I shook his hand, you understood why he was an Olympian.
Right.
He's shot put silver medalist, I believe. He does not look like he's lost any muscle. Just going to leave it at that.
Yeah. That's a whole different level of being physically unique. But so Oregon's, as I mentioned, has got 1 5-star offensive tackle already. They're going after both these guys, got a real shot. I don't have an expectation in my mind, Brian, that they land both of these guys. It'd be great to land one of them in addition to Kodi Greene, who's an absolute stud. But could you see a world where Oregon lands 3 5-star offensive tackles in the same class?
No. I don't know if anybody's ever done that. The only way I could see it, because the 3 would have to agree going in, one of them's going to have to move to guard preemptively. Nobody wants to be the guy that's the 5-star moving to guard. That's usually kind of how that. There's been a few exceptions to that. Quentin Nelson did it at Notre Dame, but he was so good at guarding.
I mean, that worked out. Look, I'm just saying, that worked out pretty well. That guy was good.
This thing called the Hall of Fame down the line. But that's the exception to the rule. But for the most part, it's just a scenario where kids want to play tackle that are tackles. So maybe there is, maybe it's Greene, maybe it's Cantwell. I don't know, but they're all good enough to play tackle and maybe even left. So that's why I think it's hard. But Oregon is a very unique brand, and every time I think they're not going to do something, they do. So I tell you this all the time on and off the show. They're the hardest school to predict. It's not even close because they do almost exclusively out of state and oftentimes out of region recruiting. Like Cantwell probably didn't know diddly about Oregon other than the uniforms before they started recruiting. I mean, he's from Missouri. Iheanacho, he's from Baltimore. Like, there's no way. So it's really hard to say. But I know just from talking to the big guys, they both truly like Oregon. That's face-to-face conversations. So that's a starting point.
Yeah.
And they're taking unofficial visits. So you're going to get him on campus for an OB. I expect both to at least OB to UG. That's all you can ask for at this point. I mean, it's early March.
Just have a chance, make the maximum investment, see if you can land one of them. That'd be the best offensive line haul Oregon's ever had. They've had the highest rated offensive lineman ever to commit to Oregon, Josh Connerly. It worked out pretty well for Oregon, particularly this past season. But they just brought in the best defensive back haul they have ever had in 2025. How does Chris Hampton follow that up in 2026? We'll talk about that next. First, this episode brought to you by Nissan. The Armada Team of the Week is brought to you by our friends at Nissan and the all-new 2025 Nissan Armada. Each week, our Locked On College basketball experts are picking one team that stands apart. From top-seeded stars to the unexpected upsets, these guys showcase the strength and sheer power needed to push their team forward. And you know what? I'm calling an audible here and saying Oregon is the Nissan Armada Team of the Week. Why? Because they've won 6 straight games. They beat Indiana on Tuesday night. They're going to try to make it 7 to end the regular season on Sunday when they go to Seattle and play the Huskies. And look, nothing about that game is going to be easy. But this team has been playing its best basketball at the right time. And that's what you want to see. When it comes to the Nissan Armada, they say go forth and conquer. And that's exactly what the Ducks have done in the last couple of weeks. It's clear that the team of the week is out here ready to conquer the road ahead with confidence, just like you can in the all-new Nissan Armada and any of Nissan's outstanding vehicles. Take the Nissan Armada, Rogue, or Pathfinder and go find your next big adventure. Shop at nissanusa.com. All right, Brian, thoughts on Devon Benjamin, who got a crystal ball recently, talked about him on yesterday's show to commit to Oregon. Now, crystal balls go, 65% success rate. I would say Wiltfong is usually pretty darn good, but no one has a 100% hit rate there. But, Oregon's defensive back recruiting class, I'm very curious to see where it ends up after the haul they brought in 2025. They got Chris Hampton Recruiter of the Year, according to 24/7 Sports. But let's start with Benjamin, one of the top safeties in this class, who's got a crystal ball to the Ducks.
That's a kid that, it's funny you mentioned that he's safety. It just depends on which network you look at. Some think he is a corner. I personally like him as a nickel, but I know that everybody just wants him on their football team. That's a kid that scores touchdowns playing defense. That's good. So he's a kid that Oregon and just about the entire free world are after. He's a California kid from just outside of LA. Holy cow, is he athletic. This is a plug-and-play guy all over the place, kind of like a certain guy they got out of Alabama this past year. So he reminds me of.
Naeem Offord.
Yeah, he's solid. Naeem Offord's not just a good player. Like, he's going to start, I think, at Oregon this year. And I think this kid can too. I'm not saying Devon's dead set going to start like as a freshman, but length, speed, very physical. That's a great sign. And he's talked up the Ducks. So, I mean, they got the Recruiter of the Year at his spot. They got to at least be in the hunt, right? I mean, if they're getting him on campus. So I wouldn't count out the Ducks for anybody in the LA area that they try to get.
I'm curious to see what Offord's role is this year. You and I have talked about him several times because there could absolutely be an open spot to start at nickel. And there was a report that, he's going to make the transition to safety. And then Tosh Lupoy said, no, we recruited him to play corner. That was kind of the whole point here. I mean, we could move him, but like we're gonna probably play him at corner or nickel. But there are openings at those particular spots. But I mean, playing a significant role as a true freshman, I don't care what position or how talented you are. That's a tall order. Not impossible, not unheard of since Dan Lanning took over back before the 2022 season, where a couple of true freshmen had at least some sort of role on the team. Guys like Josh Connerly, Jordan James, and a couple of others. But I think that for Benjamin, Brian, if Offord were to start at nickel this year, then you presume he's going to start at nickel for the next 2 years, right? Like I wouldn't think they, lock him into that spot if he does start. So if they were to bring in Benjamin, how do you feel about him playing on the back end of the defense?
I think he can play any of them. He's just like Offord. And I disagree about Offord. He's so good, it doesn't matter. You put him where you're weakest because he'll eliminate the weakness. That's a great problem to have.
Yes.
You could put Alford at running back, and he can compete for the starting job. I've seen him do that too. He's a really good running. He's that good.
I feel like that's a really strange crossover positional versatility. Corner, safety, and running back. Like typically,
I know. Alford's that, like, he dominated in the Birmingham area as a running back. That area does not suck. Like running around guys, running through guys, making guys look stupid in one-on-ones. Besides that, he couldn't do anything.
Yeah. That's all he could do? Oh, man. Why'd they even bring this guy onto campus? But another defensive back that Oregon is after in 2026 is Elbert Hill, who's spoken on the record several times with my guy Max Torres over at Scoop Duck about his interest in Oregon. Have you heard anything on Hill with regards to where he stands with the Ducks? Who else is kind of in the fold there? Because, Oregon's got one defensive back commit in Xavier Larice, who's from your neck of the woods in Florida, ball hawking kind of safety, 4-star out of the state of Florida. But, it seems like they're still going to keep loading up on the defensive side of the ball, even though they're kind of light on offensive recruitments right now.
Well, Reese, first off, I saw him this past weekend at Miami Under Armour. I got a pick in one of the one-on-ones. He's tremendous. Corner, nickel, safety again. I don't care where you play him. He's an elite kid. Elbert Hill it's weird. He's from Northern Ohio. The Ducks are one of the few teams that seem to do well in Ohio, not named Ohio State. But his other visits are going to be the Ducks, Alabama, Penn State, Michigan, Ohio State. So it's an elite deal. And the kid's just fast as all get out. Not the biggest corners, 5'10", 5'11", but he likes Bama a lot. And Oregon, those two have really kind of caught his attention. Will he come back around and decide he wants to stay closer at home, go to Penn State or Ohio State? That's possible. But right now, Oregon and Alabama are two of the schools that caught his attention. Look, like I said a little bit ago, Oregon is the hardest school to predict, and Alabama is still Alabama too. He's got a really good relationship with their staff. So possibly a Bama situation where maybe they get their one random kid a year they get from somebody else's backyard. Maybe it's Elbert Hill. But Oregon's been doing that for the last 10 years. So I wouldn't bet against that either. So I don't know. This is really hard because Oregon doesn't make it easy for me with any kid. It's always out of somebody else's backyard.
Yeah, Oregon's 2025 DB recruiting haul, I've discussed it before and how great it was. Best Oregon has ever had. Trey McNutt, Dorian Brew. Like, you just keep going down the list. Naeem Offord, of course, and Brandon Finney. Do you think that class can serve as kind of a transformative moment for Oregon on the trail? Because they used to recruit wide receivers fine, but now all of a sudden they can go get the number one receiver in the country into Corey Moore and flip guys like Jeremiah McLaughlin from Ohio State and just be in, the mix and ultimately land that caliber of guys. Do you think the 2025 class for Oregon with their secondary recruiting can serve as kind of that foundational jump forward point to, hey, this is where, Oregon expects to be able to recruit this position group now?
If the DB coach stays there, yes. It's still about relationships. We love that word here. And it's just because that's why kids pick schools. So obviously you have the recruiter of the year. I'm going to guess that he's good at communicating.
Yeah.
And also it's still Oregon. They were in the playoff. They were ranked number 1. So if they come out and have a good year this year, I know you're not quite as high on them for this next season because they lost so many guys, and I get it. But if they can even make the playoff or something like that, kind of to build off of that, why not? They've got the right staff to recruit. They got the brand and the uniforms and everything. Phil Knight's NIL money, all that. Why not? Why would you bet against them? I would say yes, it's far more likely than no.
Yeah, and I've struggled on where to have my expectations for this year because, man, they're losing a lot. They're going to be 105th in returning production in the country at just 43%, which is difficult. But then I just keep going back to their schedule, Brian. They're probably going to be favored in 11 games that they play this year. So, down a quote unquote down season for Oregon is what most programs would consider an up, great, amazing season. And like, it's difficult for me in my head to just be like, no, they've lost too much. They're not going to. Then I look at their schedule. I'm like, I don't know who they're losing to. Like Oklahoma State and Oregon State are their non-conference games. They're both at home. Yeah, I'm going to take that as 2 wins. It's hard to win at Autzen Stadium, but Before we talk about receivers later in the show, what's the impact of on-field results in these sorts of recruiting battles for coaching staffs and how they talk to players?
It's huge, especially if it's an in-state battle or one that's like your rival, like Oregon, USC. I'm sure there's a lot of smack talking in the recruiting world.
Negative recruiting.
1,000,000%. Now, Michigan, Ohio State, and then there's Florida State, whatever schools you want, that's a factor. So like the game, I'm assuming that if I remember correctly, Oregon plays at Penn State this next year.
Yep, at Penn State for game 5.
That game will be obviously very difficult. That's a crazy environment, all that. But if they win, they can use that as a catapult. If Penn State wins, they can't. Like, there's a lot of stuff like that matters. And it used to be if you had a down year or a great year, regardless, like one game, it would be another cycle in recruiting before it really mattered. Now it's like 2 weeks. Within two, like if you win a big game like that, if they go to Beaver Stadium and win, Oregon will capitalize immediately. So that can be a massive. Maybe they get Iheanacho, who will probably be at that game. Maybe they get somebody else. You got to look at not just who you get to come to your campus, but when you go to somebody else's and kick their butt, those recruits see it. I have stories about that for days. But Oregon, why not? 10-2 is like going to be like the bottom end for what they should be this next year.
I think their floor is 9-3 with the schedule that they've got, and I think their ceiling's 11-1, which is why I'll probably end up landing on 10-2. But then I don't know where I'm picking. Like Penn State would be the obvious loss to pick, and I still think Oregon's capable of winning the game. I just think like cross country road trip. Penn State is at home off a bye. Like that's just tough. Stuff's just working against Oregon there. Them's the breaks sometimes in college football. But then elsewhere, I look around, I go, are they losing at Iowa, who doesn't score? Or is Washington going to take a step forward and pull an upset? I don't know. Something that I'll probably explore on future episodes of the show. But on the future segment of this show, we're going to talk about the wide receiver room. Chris Henry or bust? No, don't be silly, guys. Knock it off. All right, Brian. So the biggest receiver recruit Oregon's after is the biggest receiver recruit in the country. Again, Chris Henry Jr., current Ohio State commit. And, the Junior Adams departure threw a wrench into Oregon's plans here. I'm sure at some level they bring over Ross Douglas from Syracuse, who I think has got a strong track record, but, still has just one thing left to prove as a wide receivers coach, and that's how do you recruit? Because he hasn't really been at the college ranks for a really long time, so he hasn't established an identity. But the production from the passing game that he was a part of last year, more productive than anybody else in the country. But one guy that Oregon's after, who they're likely to get a visit from, is Messiah Hampton, a 4-star wideout. What can you tell us about him?
He's from upstate New York, and he's a very rare kid. He plays for 24K 7-on-7 program I know well, and I've been to their workouts. I've seen him play 7-on. I've seen him at the Under Armour camp. He came all the way down to Miami this past weekend. Was, I thought, the best receiver there, which is saying something, because there'll be multiple guys go to the NFL from that Under Armour, just at the receiver position. Hampton's ability to run routes, his ability to get in shape, and always wanting more is pretty crazy. Like, he'll send videos to his coaches of him working out in the snow. He's a little different. Yeah, he's that guy. And Oregon, Ohio State, Miami, USC, Notre Dame just offered him, Penn State. He's got a pretty impressive list of offers, pretty much everybody now. Oregon, Southern Cal, Miami, I think are possibilities. Penn State's kind of the local best option. Syracuse is in on him, but I don't know if Notre Dame's really got a shot. They just offered, but the Ducks are definitely involved. Now they got to get him on campus. It's another one of these cross countries that you're like, Oregon won't get him. But there's always 4 or 5 of those a year that end up going Oregon's way. Nobody picked Xavier Larice to go to Oregon. He's committed to Oregon. So we have to see how that goes, but a great kid, very thoughtful and very intelligent. So he'll weigh his options. And Oregon's passing game is pretty good now. So why wouldn't he consider him?
Yeah, and the cross-country factor is interesting because you're right that Oregon has always had some pretty high-profile recruits. Ife Obadegwu was from back east. Brandon Finney, a lot of people thought he was going to flip to Penn State. Oregon kept him committed. Now he's coming in as a true freshman this year. Those are a couple of really highly touted defensive back recruits from the other side of the country, going back a few years. Dante Thornton's from the Baltimore, Maryland area. He ended up picking Oregon. Like there are always a handful. And I mean, look at, the guys we've talked about today. You've got Iheanacho is from the Maryland area. You've got Cantwell, who's from Missouri. And then we're talking about Messiah Hampton as well. And what do you know? He's from New York. So it's all over the place. Oregon's a long way from home. But hey, it's a big, beautiful country out there. Guys should see as much of it as they can. But with Ross Douglas inserted as Oregon's wide receiver coach, Brian, where do you think Duck fans should have their expectations for his first recruiting class? He's got, or he's yet to have his first commit as Oregon's wide receiver coach. But, when do you think that might change? And, can he come in and right away go and flip a Chris Henry from Ohio State just on Oregon's brand power alone? Or do you think that's too tall of a task?
I know Chris well enough to know that's going to be hard. He lived in Cincinnati for a while, and Ohio State with receivers, they don't lose many receivers. That's the hardest task there is in the recruiting world. With that being stated, he's now at Mater Dei in Los Angeles, so it's a little easier because it is closer to home, but we'll see how that goes. As far as a timetable, because they're going after elite kids, it'll be no later than June when the official visits happen, but it's not out of the question it can happen in April or May. Wouldn't shock me at all. Spring game, something like that. He's got a Syracuse offense that he was a part of. They were number one in passing last year, if I remember correctly.
In the country, yes, they were.
So it's not like he's going to have a hard time saying, I know how to coach receivers. Secondarily, he's going to say, look, I was at Syracuse, we did this. Can imagine what we could do with everybody we have at Oregon. It's an easy sales pitch. So I'm going to guess they get one at least within the next couple of months. It's an elite receiver that got everything in play. And finally, Fran Brown at Syracuse won't hire guys that can't recruit. That guy either could recruit or he was at least on his way to learning it, and then Fran got him over the top, or he wouldn't have been on that staff. So Oregon probably got a pretty darn good recruiter as well.
Yeah, Fran Brown at Syracuse. A coaching name to watch in the coaching carousel in the coming years. You win 10 games at Syracuse in your first season. If he follows that up with another 8-9 win campaign, and suddenly he's looking up going, hey, look, 2 years at Syracuse as a head coach, and I've won 18, 19, 20 games or so. That's pretty good. And by the way, he came from Kirby Smart's staff at Georgia. Those guys, I hear, can really coach. And Brian Smith can really talk recruiting. Check him out on Locked On the Portal on YouTube and wherever you get your podcast. Appreciate everyone listening. I will see you next time. And until then, hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and go Ducks.